Hello, good afternoon, community action. Hello, hello. We're going to give folks just a minute to get in and get settled. While you're coming in, if you want to say hi in the chat, you can say who you are, where you're from, any other niceties you want to share with the crowd. We're going to have a pretty big group today. So bear with us for just a minute while we let folks come in and get settled. Everyone should be able to use the chat. I'll give it just one more minute. Wait for the numbers to kind of level off here a little bit. Okay, we're starting to level off. So we'll go ahead and dive in the interest of respecting everyone's very precious time. So want to say good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Really excited for today's session, which is about CSBG organizational standards and some of the core practices that you can do to support your agency's success with those organizational standards. So I'm Mary Beth Schneber-Remrev. I am the Director of Organizational Capacity Building here at NCAP. Org Standards is one of the many things I have the privilege of working on here at the partnership. I'm joined today by my colleague, Terry Bearden. Terry will be behind the scenes to kind of help troubleshoot if you have any questions, if you need anything. Please feel free to reach out to her, put it in the chat throughout our session today. That does bring me to an important point. We are in webinar mode because there's a lot of you who want to talk about org standards, which makes my heart very, very happy. But because of that, we are using the webinar chat. If you have questions, comments, you can put them in there. You can also use the Q&A function throughout the webinar today. If you're on here with maybe your boss or someone else that you're like, oh gosh, I don't want to ask that question out loud. Number one, I want to assure you there are no silly questions. But two, I understand if you want to ask a private question, you can do so in the Q&A function. There's the ability to ask an anonymous question, okay? Please put that stuff in as we go. I'll try to be responsive as we go throughout today's webinar. One other point is that we are recording today's webinar, and friends, you will get a copy of this recording and a copy of the slides at the end of the week, okay? So don't feel like you have to frantically take notes or take pictures of slides. They're all coming your way. Great to see everyone joining us from all over the country. Thanks for saying hello in the chat. Before we get going into the content of today's webinar, I want to take a moment to ground ourselves in the promise of community action. I hope wherever you are in the world right now, you'll read it along with me. This promise reads that community action changes people's lives, embodies a spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. This promise is core to community action. It might feel somehow separate from the organizational standards, but the organizational standards really support and ensure that we have the capacity that we need to fulfill this very important promise that we make to ourselves and to our communities. So, also in the chat, I would love to know, whenever we talk about org standards in person, I hear all kinds of words that come up and sometimes groans and sounds. But I would love to know, what is one word that you think of when you hear the term CSBG Organizational Standards? And you can go ahead and put that into the chat. I'll tell you, the word that comes up for me is capacity. And I'll probably use that term a whole lot during our time together today. I'm seeing a lot of compliance. I also see a history. I love that. Structure, community, accountability, lots and lots of compliance, rules, yes, accountability, right. Accountability to ourselves, accountability to each other, accountability to our funders, our communities. I love it. Rules, accountability, framework. Okay, great. Glad to see these words coming up. They're all safe for work. Really appreciate that. And I don't see any groans. So hey, we're amongst friends here, ready to dive in and chat about the org standards. So this is what we're going to do here together today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the organizational standards are. Spoiler alert, we are not going to go through all of the standards, okay? We just don't have time to do that. It's not really the purpose of today's call. But we're going to talk about what to do if you have questions about specific standards during our time together today. So we'll talk about what the standards are, why they're important, and then we'll dive into what are some things that everybody can do to support compliance and support achieving those CSBG organizational standards. So kind of broad practices that everybody can do. And then we'll leave you with some tools and resources. Please, please, please don't hang up when you see that we get to tools and resources because we have lots of great tools that are available to support you with the organizational standards. And I want to flag for you a new tool that the partnership put out on scenario planning that I want to make sure everybody has seen. So please stick around with us till the end. Okay, with that, let's just dive on in. So what you see on the screen in front of you is the national theory of change. And this is the community action theory of change. And essentially what this does is it articulates the big goals that all 1,000 of us strive for in our work, right? We have 3 big goals that no matter kind of who you are, where you are in the country, what your agency looks like, your agency likely works on at least one of these 3 big goals. And then we have this kind of next level down that goes into services and strategies, the work that we do to make these big goals happen. And we have some core principles that we deeply believe that guide the way that we do the work, that guide those services and strategies and those big goals that we are working towards. And this is a fabulous graphic and a fabulous way to articulate kind of what is important to community action, the work that we do, and why we do the work that we do. And then something that's kind of unique about us is we have this whole section on performance management over here. And this section really dives into this idea that in community action, yes, we care about doing the work, but we also care about that approach that we use to doing that work to make sure that we are operating efficiently and effectively. And so within that little square, essentially what you're seeing now is we're kind of zooming in on that square. We have kind of 2 key questions that we ask ourselves all of the time. How well are we operating and what difference do we make? And what you see built in there are, for what difference we make, we have some ways to ensure that we're making a difference in a way that we track that we make a difference through national performance indicators for families and communities, which get reported in the CSBG annual report. Okay. On the other side of that coin, though, is the how well did we operate? So we have built into there this idea that we need some basic level of standards for what we all have to do in order to be able to do this work effectively. Those are the local CSBG organizational standards. A unique thing too about community action is we didn't stop at kind of, putting standards in place for service providers, but we also included state and federal accountability measures because we recognize in this environment, we need all of our players working together in support of our big goals. Also in this section is our beloved results-oriented management and accountability system, ROMA, our performance management framework. Today, we're going to really focus on that first point about local organizational standards, though. Okay. So a couple of quick key points for you about the org standards. Really, for those of you who were around back when they started, you will remember that these standards were designed by the network for the network. This wasn't a think tank in DC or the feds who came up with the standards. The standards were really developed by community action professionals from across the country with input from all of us all over the country. Some of us will remember the extensive webinars and input sessions that we had into the standards. And really what they were meant to do is just to ensure that if you're going to be a part of this incredible network, that you have the needed capacity to be able to fulfill that important role, right? That you have the needed practices, processes, capacity, I keep coming back to capacity, to be able to administer CSBG and be a community action agency. And so as we dreamed about, so what does it mean? What are some of the basic capacities that folks have to have? We looked to some places for guidance. And one of the places we looked is the CSBG Act itself, right? So you'll notice that some of the standards, some of the organizational standards basically come directly out of the CSBG Act itself. Important note for you to think about there, that means that if you were to miss some of the standards, if it's a standard that's in the CSBG Act, you might actually be out of compliance with the federal law, which is, a bigger deal perhaps than being out of compliance with an organizational standard. So good to know which of those standards tie to the Act and which do not. Similarly, we look to OMB guidance, right? Like there are some federal rules about how we're supposed to administer our funding and administer our programs. Similar concept here. If you're out of compliance with those org standards, you might be out of compliance with some bigger things as well that you should be paying attention to. We looked to lots of federal laws, regulation, but we also went in and looked at like what's kind of just good management practice, right? Because it's not just about compliance. We also want to ensure that we are, operating effectively. And then very importantly, these standards aren't just kind of like administrative benchmarks for us to meet. They also reflect our values and those things that are really important to us as community action. So we have baked in who we are into these standards that we call on for ourselves, right? So a question that comes up sometimes is folks will say, well, where do I find that the CSBG organizational standards are required? Where are they in the Act, in the CSBG Act? And here's the thing is that the CSBG Act was last reauthorized in 1998. The organizational standards didn't come about until fiscal year 2016, federal fiscal year 2016, calendar year 2017 basically is when they're implemented. But so if you go back to the Act, you're not going to see them there. They actually show up in an OCS information memoranda, which is like a really technical term. But essentially what it means is it's kind of guidance that our federal funder gives us about how we are to implement the program, right? And so CSBG IM 138 is where you will find the requirement that we all have to meet the organizational standards. So Terry has put that into the chat for you. It is a great read, I promise. Do check out that source documentation. So the organizational standards were divided into 3 thematic groups with kind of 9 categories here. So you can see that the first category is maximum feasible participation. This is one of those spaces where you see us leaning in hard on who are we, what are our values, what is important to us. And so we have a category around consumer input and involvement, right? Community engagement and community assessment. Community assessment and the idea of maximum feasible participation, by the way, do appear in the CSBG Act itself. So even though these are kind of value-laden standards, they are also tied to legal requirements for the Community Action Network. Some of the standards are. Also, then we have a whole category on vision and direction, right? And this category, I look down this category and I go, any nonprofit would need to do these things well to be effective, right? You've got to have strong organizational leadership. Goodness gracious, your board has to be performing effectively and efficiently. You have to have an involved and engaged board, and you need to do some strategic planning. You need to be thinking out kind of big picture, where do we need to go? And then in that last category, similarly, almost any nonprofit needs to be able to do these things well, right? You have to have some human resource management, financial operations and oversight, and, using your data and analyzing your data to make your programs better over time. So all of the standards tie to one of these categories. Some of these categories, some of the standards actually kind of cross categories, and I'll give you an example of that a little bit later. But big picture, this is what the standards call for, or what's in the standards. So a few more key points for you. So within the standards themselves are assessed by your state office, your CSBG state office. And so the state determines if standards are met or unmet. There is no partial credit. You don't get like yeah, you met, 80% of this. That's not how the standards are meant to be used. It's either met or unmet. That can get a little bit complicated, friends, when you get into a standard that might have multiple requirements in there. Like if you're missing one piece of it, your state might assess you as being kind of not met in that standard, okay? There are also there are significant differences, I should say, between the standards for a public CAA and a private CAA. And if you're going, I don't know which one of those things I am. If you are a unit of local government, a council of government, city government, something like that, those are typically our public CAAs. If you are a private nonprofit entity, a 401c3, you are likely a private CAA, okay? And so public CAAs just operate a little bit different, and the standards, therefore, reflect some of those key differences. Public CAA friends on this call, you'll notice that the standards, one of the places where they get really different for you are in the board governance, because you have either an administering or an advisory board, as opposed to like a true nonprofit board. Things also get different for you in HR, because some of those things might be out of your control, as well as in finance. Very important that when you're looking at the standards, that you are sure that you're looking at the correct version of the standards. There are no additional standards for public CAAs. There are some that are not required of you, and there are some that are just like a very smidge different. If you're not sure which set of standards apply to you, you should ask your state office. They can advise you best. More on that in a minute too. So one of the other things that you'll notice in the standards, you might read them and go, gosh, these things are broad, and that is intentional. There are 1,000 of us coast to coast. We want to be sure that, that everyone has the flexibility that they need to be able to implement these practices as it makes sense for them in their local communities, right? The other thing that you'll notice in the standards themselves is it doesn't say, here's the documentation that you need to provide. That is not really up to us. It's not up to the feds. It's really a state decision about kind of what is required to document what constitutes meeting a standard. And then another kind of point here is that you'll notice that the standards ask you to assess whether or not you have something in place, right? Do you have a tripartite board? Yes or no? Well, great, but that doesn't tell us, do you have a great board? Do you have an engaged board? It's not assessing that. It's asking, do you have a risk assessment? Yes or no? It doesn't, assure that you have a high quality risk assessment. It assures that you have a risk assessment. And this is where it can get a little tricky for folks, is to remember that org standards are a minimum kind of requirement for you to be a community action agency. If you are inspired and interested in going beyond the minimum, you're in the right place, number one, but you can look to other kind of best practices like the community action standards of excellence to kind of inform what does best in class practice look like. The org standards are about that kind of minimum level of compliance though, which is a word that a lot of you used when we first started. So I started to speak to this just a minute ago, but just to kind of dot that I, in community action in general, well, in CSBG in particular, remember that CSBG is a block grant, which means that the feds provide general guidance. They block grant that money to the state with that general guidance. And then they say, states, it is up to you to administer this funding as you see fit within these confines in your state. So state offices have to create the policy and guidance for what happens at that state level. So therefore, the states are the ones who are responsible for providing you guidance about the org standards and then assessing your compliance with the org standards. It's not a federal decision. It's not, it's certainly not NCAP who does that, right? So a really important point here is that implementation, guidance, and assessment of the organizational standards is going to look different state to state. So if you have friends across state lines, y'all can chat about what the org standards require, but just remember that there can be nuances in how different states assess the standards, and certainly in some of how states approach assessing the standards. There are lots and lots of ways that states assess standards. I've seen it done kind of as a desk monitoring. I've seen it done, with at the time that they do contract monitoring out on site. A lot of states have moved to like kind of an upload process within their data system. So you should get familiar with what is the way that your state does it, what's the timeline that they do it on, so that you can be familiar with that and take that into account. So I think I have covered all of the points I want to make here. Kind of another important point for you is to remember that organizational standards are really important, but they are only a piece of your overall kind of picture. They are not your end all be all. And they are really specifically a piece of your compliance picture, right? You have lots of standards, lots of grant requirements, lots of rules that you have to follow. The org standards are important, and I just want you to keep in mind that they're only a piece of the overall puzzle. One of the funny things that we always get into with the organizational standards, and you'll hear me try to walk this line as we talk about this today, is that, we want to remember that organizational standards are, that there's minimum compliance requirements. And so there's that. And a lot of the practices that the org standards talk about are really central to community action, and they're important to us. And so you might find yourself at times trying to balance this, like, how do I check the box to be sure that I'm compliant? And also, I don't want to just check the box, I also want to be sure that I'm really doing this to the best of my ability. And here's the thing, is that over time, there may be times where, you really need to just check the box on some practices because it's not a focus, and you're really trying to fully live in to the intent of the standards. Just as your organization changes, as your priorities change, as the world around you changes. But I do encourage everybody to really think about, whenever you read the org standards, go back to, why is this important? Why is this important to us, to help inform the practice that you utilize, okay? So that's kind of the overview of the org standards. I have not seen any questions come in. Terry, anything that you're seeing on your side? I see lots of hellos in the chat. Hello, hello.
I don't see anything at this time, Mary Beth.
Okay, hopefully that means, because I explained it so well, that everyone is still with me. So cool. All right, so then let's get into, what are some core practices that you can do to support the organizational standards. So as I said, this is not going to be a rundown of each of the standards. This is more globally, what are those things that you can do within your organization? And as we go, friends, I might ask you to put some things into the chat, some advice you might have, or questions you have. Please keep those things coming. So right off the bat, the first thing I want to say is that one of the core practices that's really important in the org standards are our leaders and leadership. And my leader friends on this call, I want to tell you, you set the tone. Are organizational standards important? Are they just compliance? How you view them is likely to impact how your team views them. And so, in organizations where we see the org standards are really prioritized and talked about, guess what? We tend to see better, better compliance with those standards, right? Agencies being assessed as fully meeting the standards because there's a concerted focus and effort on them. So there's lots of ways that leaders can communicate and not communicate that the standards are important. By the way, not communicating is often communication, right? Not hearing something, what gets measured gets done. What you pay attention to is what gets done as well, right? So leaders, if you're not talking about, asking about organizational standards and their performance, it might not be a focus for your team. So be thinking about how you are putting the organizational standards out there in context for leaders in your organization and for staff too, right? And your board especially. And if I have any board members on the call, Boards, there are so many standards that apply to you and are important to you, and it's something you should be asking questions about. Where are we doing really well? Where could we maybe use a little more focus? So this is one of those times I would love to ask folks, if you are a leader and you've done something really cool to really center org standards or communicate that they are important to you, would love for you to put that in the chat or give your advice to your peers on how you set the tone that org standards are important. While you're doing that, I am going to talk about a related concept, which is teamwork. Um, the org standards are bigger than any one person or any one role within your agency. When we're in person and we get to this slide, there's usually like one person in the back who's cheering. And I promise you, it's because that's the person who's been tasked with doing the organizational standards. You might have a central person who is responsible for coordinating the overall approach to the organizational standards. However, look at those big buckets we looked at: HR, finance, boards. One person doesn't do all of those things, right? Um, uh, but you likely need a person to be in charge of getting, the documentation, information from all of those different functions. So, leaders, one of the things that you can help to do is, one, deputize that person who is in charge of the standards, make sure it's clear that they're responsible for it, support them in that. And then two, talk about how we are all ultimately accountable for our performance. All of us are. It's important to all of us. So the more that we can work cross-functionally, the stronger that we're going to be as an organization here. So want to give some virtual chocolate to Jennifer. If we were in person, I promise I would give you chocolate. How about next time I see you, I owe you chocolate. But Jennifer said about how she centers org standards as a leader is I build our staff and board meeting agendas around the org standards. Each agenda has the specific standard that will be part of the meeting with definitions so that all people who attend know what the standard is and how it applies to the topic of that meeting. That is so cool. I love that, Jennifer. And it actually, I promise, guys, I did not pay Jennifer to put that into the chat, but it actually ties to one of the next pieces on the slide, which is about shared understanding. Because like for this teamwork concept to work, you have to have some shared understanding across your team about what the standards are and what is required, right? So, one of the great things that you can do is sit down with your team and go over, okay, here are the standards that we have to meet. Here is what is actually required for us to do, based on what they're saying, right? Sometimes we see where folks bump into some challenges where they're reading more into a standard than is actually there because they really want to do that best practice thing, Don't make it harder than it has to be on yourselves, okay? Look to see, what does the standard say I have to do? And make sure we all have a shared understanding of that, right? The other thing is that you should read the standards in context and as a whole. And so what I mean by that is that there are standards that cross several different categories. So a really good example of this is standard 6.4. It says customer satisfaction data and customer input collected as part of the community assessment is included in the strategic planning process. Whew. So if you stop and think about that for a minute, customer satisfaction data and kind of customer input is actually in category 1 of the standards. Community assessment is category 3 and strategic planning is category 6. So if you were just trying to kind of look at the standards category by category and say you had a lead in strategic planning and a lead in community assessment and a lead in customer satisfaction, if you didn't take the time to really look at this standard in particular and think about how it connects all the way across, you would be at risk of potentially missing this standard, because if you don't in your community assessment process make sure you're integrating the customer satisfaction data that you're doing in category 1, then you'd miss a standard in category 6. So see, this is why it's very important that you kind of look across all of the standards to see how they connect with one another. Another really important point, I know we have a couple of states on the call here today. And so I can feel you all cheering as I say this, is that always, 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 when you're reading a standard, if you get there and you're going, I don't know what this actually means, I don't know what my state wants, I don't know what that would look like, always clarify that with your state CSBG office. That is a really good phone call to make. There are national tools that we can share with you to help you with this, to help you with kind of interpretation. But ultimately, the buck stops with your state office when it comes to organizational standards. So please reach out to your state colleagues. Once you know kind of what's required, you're clear on that, you can then set some expectations. So what does it mean for us to meet this standard? How do we document it? And who is responsible for doing it? If it is everyone's job, it is no one's job. So make sure that you're clear about who owns responsibility for each of the standards, and how they're supposed to go about doing that. And then, guys, build a process, right? Who manages all of this for you? Leaders, make sure you make that clear that their job is very important too. What that process looks like, where documentation is held, and also like when does all of the documentation need to go in? And the pro tip here for you here is to document the standards as they occur. Don't wait, until December 20th, if your standard assessment is due on December 30th to the state. Don't wait until then to start gathering your documentation. Be putting it into a file or whatever your system is throughout the year. Okay, so this is a if you know kind of slide. Just fold it in. This is a really core practice. Also, side note, clearly I don't know what folding it in looks like because I'm pretty sure my graphic is not folding it in. I think that's mixing, but yeah, if I make baked goods, don't eat them perhaps because I don't know what folded in is. But the core practice here is the core idea here is to make sure that the requirements of the org standards just become part of the way that you do business. This is one of the ways to make it so it's not like org standards are the separate thing that happen in this corner over here, but like you do these practices on an ongoing basis, right? You're doing a community assessment regularly. You're collecting customer satisfaction data. You have board meetings all of the time, right? So make sure that just the way that you do those things incorporates the requirements, build them into how you do business. So I go back to that standard about strategic planning 6.4 that says you have to collect customer satisfaction data as part of your community assessment process. Well, then your community assessment policy or framework or checklist or whatever it is that you use to kind of guide your community assessment process, have the checkbox that says, did we integrate our customer satisfaction data? Board standards too, there are so many requirements in the org standards that tie to boards. Make sure that like your board calendar accounts for some of those things that have to be done. There has to be a regular review of the performance of the executive director, for instance. We'll build it into the board calendar so that you're not getting to the end of the year and going, did we remember to do that? Well, yeah, you did because you just built it into how you do business. This is one of those like little things that can be a really big thing for your organization to save you time and heartache and headache. Also, just managing the documentation of org standards is one of those things that you can do to make this a whole heck of a lot easier. So it happens with some regularity, or people report it happens with some regularity that they did the thing, they did the practice, they just forgot to get it into the board minutes, or the person who did that left and they took their files with them, or they were erased from their computer and now we don't have that documentation. So take some time to set up what is our process for documentation? Who collects it? Who's responsible for sending it? What is the specific documentation that is needed? Remember, you kind of did this at the outset when you were setting expectations. When should it go in? And where does it live? So, back in the age of dinosaurs, when I worked at a community action agency, we had like a physical binder, where we printed all of our documentation and put it into the binder, right? These days, friends, you probably don't have to do that anymore. Leverage technology, SharePoint, Google Drives, whatever that is. Have a folder for each one of the standards and have the documentation just go in there as it happens. So That is kind of a best practice. And then the other thing I already said to you is, make it a practice and an expectation that when the standard is met, that documentation gets into the folder right away, because there's so much that can happen in a year. Gosh, our servers can go down, we lose data sometimes, right? Like those are things that can really happen. So make sure that you're thinking ahead and getting those things where they need to go just as soon as you can. So I see Amanda said we have several personnel that have access to a OneDrive folder strictly dedicated to the organizational standards. There, the documentations are dropped in the folder. That is beautiful and a great practice, right? So those staff get the documents, they put them in, and that makes it really easy to know kind of where you are throughout the year, right? Which is my last kind of global point here about things you can do on ensuring that you have the capacity to meet the org standards is to check in, right? Track your progress throughout the year. Do that, at set periods, maybe every quarter or halfway through the year you look, right, to know where you are and any standards that you still have outstanding. Leaders, this is part of where you can be really helpful too, is to ask this, right? Make it part of your regular kind of check-in with staff. The other thing that you can do that is really helpful is just to compare your results year over year, right? To stop and think about, like, are there standards that we are consistently having trouble with, or standards that we, kind of common themes of challenges that we're having? I'll tell you, hint, hint, a big one tends to be board minutes tends to be a big one that folks sometimes have a hard time with. But the other thing is sometimes, like, you still meet the standards, right? So it might say you meet 100%, but it was painful to get there, right? So have that end of year check-in of, like, how did this go? What can we do better next year? What should we build into our process for the future? And that allows you to really use that data to improve. And then hopefully over time, this gets more refined and easier and better. And I alluded to the fact that, I remember when we first started this, and golly, it was painful and hard, and we have come leaps and bounds in terms of our ability to meet and document and exceed organizational standards over time. So kudos to this incredible network for all of your hard work in that space. So please don't hang up. I'm watching the participant count right now and watching who's leaving. But questions, comments, and advice. This is a really good time. If you have a specific question, if you have a comment, go ahead and start putting that into the chat, or advice for your peers. Several of your peers have given advice. I love it. Thank you. Keep it coming. You can put it into the Q&A. There's an anonymous feature there if you want to ask an anonymous question. You can put it here in the chat. And because I know it takes folks a little bit of time to type that in, what I'm going to do while you're doing that is go over our tools and resources, and then I'll stop and come back to your questions, okay? So don't leave just yet. We have lots of tools and resources to help you with your organizational standards. And now these are just some of the tools that we have at the national level. You probably have some state level tools as well. So familiarize yourself with those too. At NCAP, if you go to this part of the website, which Terry just so helpfully put into the chat right there, this is where you can find all of our org standards tools and resources. So we have some tools to help you with assessing, where are you with the standards? There's an assessment tool for states, an assessment tool for CAAs. We have separate tools for public and private CAPs. And we have some additional guidance. I don't think I mentioned COE. COE stands for the Center of Excellence. Remember way back when I said that the standards were developed by the network for the network. NCAP, through its Center of Excellence, helped lead that process. And so you'll see the COE abbreviation on a number of things. It basically means those standards that were developed through that effort that was led by the Center of Excellence and NCAP, okay? So you'll see our guidance, you'll see those final standards. Here's just some screenshots of what that looks like. There is a glossary of terms that you can use to kind of familiarize yourself with what the heck some of the words mean. Some of the alphabet soup is solved there in the glossary. This tool is really helpful. this is a calendar of required actions, because a lot of the standards are required on an ongoing basis or an annual basis, but some of them are required like every 2, 3, even 5 years. And that can get really hard to track over time, right? It's easy to lose that ball over time. So this is a really nice kind of roadmap of here's all the standards and here's when they're required. And then there's some information on the documentation that you can use there. Standard 4.3 is one of the most commonly asked about standards. And uh, folks have said, well, how do I document that I have used the services of a Roma certified professional in my work? And this tool makes it really simple for you to document that. Now, your state might have other requirements or expectations. This doesn't work for everybody, but you can ask your state, um, if they have a preferred template or tool, or if this one would work for you. So that tool is also on our website. I mentioned calendars and boards, and golly, that calendar of board actions is really important too, to make sure that you are fully meeting the requirements of your board standards. So this tool is also very helpful, breaks it down for your board. We also have these technical assistance guides that go beyond just kind of regurgitating what the standards are. And they provide you some information about, like, what's the definition, what's the intent, what are the documents you can use? And then we do also give you some tips for if you decide to go beyond compliance, some guideposts that you could look to for that as well, and some additional resources. The technical assistance guides are really great. Some of the technical assistance guides also have some webinars alongside of them. You might open them and go, well, these look like they were done a few years ago. They were, but the standards they haven't changed. So, that content is still relevant and helpful for you. I will also just plug that if you are like itching to go deep on the org standards, that NCAP is holding a skill builder training. We are doing it virtually later this month, March 18th and 20th. You can still register if you want to join us for that. We've gotten lots of great feedback about that training. And so it can be a really fun way to spend time with Terry and I, March 18th and 20th. You might have heard that we were going to do an in-person virtual, good golly, a in-person skill builder. We're, going to assess that kind of as the year unfolds. We will announce future sessions just as soon as we are able to. One more tool that I wanted to make sure that friends here saw. Now, listen, this is not an organizational standard requirement. There's no requirement that you have a scenario planning process in your agency. But best practice wise, when things get uncertain, one of the things that you can do to protect your agency is to engage in some scenario planning, to think about what could happen, right? And what's like the best case scenario, kind of the middle of the road, the worst case scenario that could happen, and then to create plans for what it would look like if those things happen. So, if you think about, like, if I lost a major funding stream, what would that actually practically mean, right? What if a major employer closes, or we have a natural disaster, right? Like, what would the impact be on our finances, on our operations, on our programs, and on our broader community? So NCAP put together this new toolkit to kind of help agencies do exactly this, to do that scenario planning, to think about those scenarios and to plan for them and the future. There's no tool that was like built by NCAP within this toolkit. We're really bringing together best practice tools from places like Propel Nonprofits and from I cannot remember their name right now, but the finance folks. There's lots of great stuff in here that you can check out. So, okay, I promised you I was going to do Q&A. I saw the chat light up, and so I'm going to go there now. Okay. So I see I have some advice. I make a yearly calendar that covers the standards we need to complete each month and email it to everyone. Then I send out separate monthly reminders at the first of each month. Wow. In September, I start reminding everyone if there are standards we are missing, we have time to get them completed by the end of the year. That's a fabulous practice, Jennifer. It ensures that you have the runway that you need to make any corrections that you might need to make, chase any documentation you might need to make, and you keep it front and center in front of everybody, right? You can't forget about the org standards in that scenario. Kudos to you. Okay, Amanda said, I have also developed a tracking sheet to know when standards are due for review and on what months. That's awesome. So like you kind of know, hey, if we miss this target, we might have missed we might be off track, right? So you're not having to wait till the end of the year. That has helped greatly. We were denied for a few things surrounding training forms that were due either every year or every 2 years. Rather than remembering what we did on what year, we made our board of directors training to include those every year for review so we didn't miss the beat. So Amanda, what I hear you saying there too is like, it's that concept of folding it in, right? Just the way that we do training folds in this expectation or folds in the requirements that we're going to have to fulfill. So that's fabulous. I see some love for the tracking sheet. I like the calendar and have added that to our board orientation packet. Yes, Angie. Oh my goodness. It is so helpful. And I really, when I worked at the local agency, I loved giving my board their entire calendar for the year, not just for org standards, but for, kind of all of the things that they would have to do, right? They're going to have to approve the CSBG plan. They're going to, have to receive the audit. They're going to have to, do all of these things. I like to give that to them right on the front end so they knew exactly what to do. Okay, I would love some advice for developing a board calendar that includes org standards. Is there an easier way to do this besides going standard by standard to see what is due that year? So I guess you probably saw the tool that kind of breaks out the standards by horizon, right? What's due annually, what's due every 3 years, what's due every 5 years. The other thing I'll say is that once you've done this for a year or two, you're going to have a much better rhythm and awareness of kind of what needs to go and what needs to happen. The other thing that you can do is if you don't have it already, build your SOP, build your standard operating procedure that says every 5 years, here are the things that need to go before the board so that it's just in your policies moving forward. Okay, so we've got some links in the chat and we've got an evaluation. Terry, have I missed anything?
I do not believe so, Mary Beth.
Okay. Well, with that, the evaluation is in the chat. Would love to know, how you think this went, what else you'd like to see. And just in general, friends, if you need anything at all, Terry and I and all of us here at NCAP are here to help. We're here to support. We love to chat with you. We know a number of you have faced some really big challenges lately, and I want to say we are thinking about you. We appreciate you. And also just, I know that time is our most precious resource. It means a whole heck of a lot that you chose to spend it here with us this afternoon. So with that, I think we'll say thank you and give you back like 10 minutes of your day. Okay? Take care, everyone. See you real soon.